He expects us to comply, but this merger is unacceptable. We have to consider the long-term impact on the families.
I said enough.
The gun went off before Sade could finish her sentence. She had been standing in the middle of her father's study, the one room in the house that always smelled like cedarwood and secrets, trying to explain to Kwame, her father's oldest lieutenant, that she was not going to sign anything. She had barely gotten to the word no when the shot rang out somewhere below them, in the courtyard, and every man in that room reached for something she didn't have. "Stay here," Kwame said, and she almost laughed. She had been staying. Her entire life had been an exercise in staying exactly where her father placed her, behind piano keys, behind university gates, behind the careful fiction that the Adiemi name was simply old Lagos money that had found a new home in Seoul. She had stayed so completely, so obediently, that she had become fluent in willful blindness. She spoke 4 languages and had spent 28 years pretending she did not understand the one being spoken directly to her. Her father, Babatunde Adeyemi, was dying. Not quickly, not dramatically. He was doing it the way he had done everything else, quietly, deliberately, on his own terms. Pancreatic cancer did not care about terms, but Bar didn't know that yet, or perhaps he did, and had simply refused to negotiate. He lay in the east wing of the Seoul house, the one with the garden he'd had replanted 3 times because the first 2 gardeners had gotten the Nigerian hyacinths wrong, and he was shrinking. That was the only word for it. The man who had once filled every room he entered, who had a laugh that made strangers turn around on streets, was shrinking, and the empire he had never quite admitted to building was expanding outward into chaos without his weight to hold it down. Sade walked to the window anyway. Below, 2 men were arguing in a mixture of Yoruba and Korean that would have been almost funny in any other context. One of them, a Korean man she recognized as Park Sung-jin, Bar's logistics coordinator, was pointing at a black car with a cracked rear window. A bullet hole, she realized, fresh. "Someone tried to move on the Mapo shipment," said a voice behind her. She turned. Dio, her father's youngest enforcer, 24 years old and trying very hard to look like he wasn't terrified, was standing in the doorway. "Sungjin is saying it was the Hwang faction. Kwame thinks it's internal." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because," Dio said carefully, "your father told us that if anything happened while he couldn't." He stopped. Started again. "He said we should bring things to you." Sade looked at him for a long time. "He said that?" "Yes, Ma." She turned back to the window. Below, Sungjin had grabbed the other man by the collar. "He should have asked me first," she said quietly, but not to Dio. She went to her father's room that evening, after the house had settled into its uneasy quiet, and she sat on the edge of his bed the way she had as a child when the Lagos nights got too loud outside their first apartment, and she couldn't sleep. He looked smaller than he had 3 weeks ago. She found that she could not look directly at his hands, those enormous, careful hands that had braided her hair every Sunday morning until she was 11, that had signed documents she was never allowed to read. "They're going to tear each other apart," she said. "Yes," Bar said. His voice was still deep, still unhurried. That had not shrunk yet. "You knew this would happen." "I knew it was possible?" "Bar." She said his name the way she used to say it as a child, 2 flat syllables, a complaint and a prayer at once. "You built something that cannot survive you. Did you think about that? Did you ever think about what you were leaving?" He was quiet for a moment. The oxygen concentrator beside the bed hummed. "I thought about you," he said finally. "Every decision I made, I thought about you." "That is not an answer." "It is the only answer I have." He turned his head to look at her, and his eyes were the same eyes they had always been. Dark, warm, unbothered by guilt in a way that she had once admired and now found almost unbearable. "I am not going to apologize for keeping you safe. You kept me ignorant. Same thing in my world. It's not your world I have to live in now." He reached for her hand, and she let him take it because she was furious with him and she loved him completely, and those 2 things had always lived in her chest like mismatched furniture in a room that was still, somehow, home. "I'm not asking you to take over," he said. I never wanted that for you. Then what do you want? I want you to make sure they don't burn everything down before I'm gone. After, he paused, and the pause cost him something. After, it is not my business anymore. She did not sleep that night. In the morning, she called a meeting. Not in the study. She refused the study, with its leather chairs arranged like a throne room, but in the kitchen, standing, because she was not performing authority she did not have. Kwame came. Sungjin came stiffly, with two of his men waiting outside the door. Dio stood in the corner, like he was expecting a disaster and had decided to witness it with good posture. I am not taking over, Sade said, before anyone could speak. I want to be clear about that. I am not my father's successor. I am not interested in what he built or how he built it or who owes what to whom. Kwame, who was 62 years old and had known Bar since before Sade was born, looked at her with an expression that was equal parts respect and impatience. Then why are we here? Because you are going to destroy each other in the next 30 days, and my father is going to die listening to it happen, and I will not let that be the last thing he hears. She looked around the room. I am not here to command. I am here to translate. Sungjin frowned. Translate what? You, she said. Don't trust Kwame, because you think the Nigerian side of this organization has been siphoning from the Seoul accounts for 3 years. You, she turned to Kwame. Don't trust Sungjin, because you think he's been negotiating a separate arrangement with the Hwang faction behind my father's back. Neither of you has said this out loud to the other, because my father was the only person you both respected enough to be honest in front of. She let that land. He is still alive, barely, but I am going to sit in that room with him every evening, and I am going to tell him exactly what is happening in this house. So you can either talk to each other now in front of me, or you can talk to him directly, which I would not recommend, because the last person who raised his blood pressure spent a week deeply regretting it. There was a silence. Then slowly, Kwame pulled out a chair and sat down. After a moment, Sungjin did the same. It took 4 hours. There were moments when she thought one of them would leave, when Kwame slammed his palm on the table and said, in Yoruba, something she chose not to translate verbatim, when Sungjin went so still and cold that the temperature of the room seemed to actually drop. But she stayed. She asked questions. She clarified, redirected, refused to let either of them make declarations when they could be making arguments instead. She was not her father. She was not going to be. But she had his stillness, and it turned out that stillness, in a room full of men who had been performing fearlessness for so long they had forgotten what honesty felt like, was its own kind of power. At the end of it, there was no peace agreement. There was no resolution. What there was, a temporary ceasefire, a shared acknowledgement that the Hwang faction was the actual threat, and a grudging agreement to share information for the next 60 days. It was fragile. It was imperfect. Sade thought it might last 3 weeks before something else cracked it. It was enough. She went back to her father's room that evening and sat beside him and said nothing for a long time. He was awake, watching the garden through the window, the hyacinths dark blue in the fading light. They talked, he said. It wasn't a question. The house had its own system of knowing things, and Bar had always been at the center of it, even now. They talked, she confirmed. And nothing. It's not my organization, Bar. I told them what they needed to hear, and I'll do it again if I have to until... She stopped. Until I don't have to anymore. He was quiet. She watched his chest rise and fall. I used to think, he said slowly, that what I built was for you, a foundation, so you would never have to scramble the way I scrambled, so you would always have ground under your feet. He exhaled. I think I was also building it for myself, because a man who builds things cannot stop, even when he should. She didn't answer. She didn't forgive him. She also didn't let go of his hand. I have ground under my feet, she said finally. I found it myself. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning when the Seoul sky was doing its thing where it couldn't decide between grey and gold, Babatunde Adeyemi died quietly, between one breath and the next, with his daughter in the room and the garden outside full of hyacinths that were finally, stubbornly, exactly the right colour. Sade did not take over. She had never intended to. What she did, She spent 2 weeks in that house, talking to lawyers who had been on Barr's payroll for decades and who were, she discovered, genuinely relieved to have someone asking the right questions. She separated what was legitimate from what was not, carefully, legally, without burning anyone who didn't need to be burned. The organization did not survive her, not intact, not in the form Barr had built it, but neither did it collapse into the street war that Kwame and Sungjin had been quietly preparing for. It simply ended, the way things end when someone stops feeding them. She gave Dio an envelope with enough money to start something clean and told him once to use it that way. She didn't check. She didn't have the right to monitor the choices of a grown man, and she was tired of systems that worked through surveillance. She kept the house. She wasn't sure why. Maybe because the hyacinths were finally right. Maybe because she needed somewhere to put the grief that wasn't made entirely of ambivalence. The grief that was just missing him. Just the ordinary, devastating fact of her father being gone, without the complication of what he'd been. She sat in the garden on a Saturday, a week after the lawyers left, and she let herself cry for the first time since the hospital. Not for the organization, not for the legacy, for the man who had braided her hair every Sunday morning and laughed so loud that strangers turned around on the street and made every wrong choice, she now understood. From the inside of a love that was real even when it was damaging. She cried for that. She cried for a long time. Then she went inside and made coffee and opened her laptop and began slowly to figure out what came next. She didn't know yet. That was all right. She had ground under her feet. She had found it herself.